when I realized how many people out there with no special insight to having access to patents or anything else had to sign a non-compete clause. People making hourly wages, all designed to keep prices down, keep wages down and prices up. But 1 in 5 workers had to gave them, the company, the power over their careers. The bottom line is our economy shouldn't be about people working for capitalism. It should be about capitalism working for people, for everyone. Now I'm going to turn this over to Brian so we can get this meeting started. But again, thank each and every one of you here on this council. I really mean it. You know, I think even when we decided to do this council, some of you all thought it was a good idea, but I'd be surprised if some of you didn't go, whoa, I didn't realize how restrictive some of this was. How restrictive some of this was. But you're going to make a difference in ordinary people's lives. Ordinary people's lives are going to make a difference. So anyway, Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. We're going to give the president over to accident and
Mr. President, could you give us a brief update on your call with European leaders on what's happening in Ukraine today?
The only reason I don't like doing this is you never report on why I've called a meeting. And this is really important. I had a very, very, very good meeting, total unanimity with all the European leaders. We'll talk about it later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Will you send troops to Ukraine, sir?
Why are you sending 8,500 troops to Ukraine, possibly?
Thank you, guys.
Will you take questions on inflation then?
Let's move. Thank you. Thank you
Do
all.
you think inflation is a political liability?
That's a great asset. More inflation. What a stupid son of a bitch.
So there you have it. That's the moment right there. Everyone is talking about. Fox's Peter Doocy asking about inflation. The president not too stoked about that question. I want to bring in political analyst David Morey. David, thank you so much for being here on the show. First thoughts on that response from the president?
It's good to be with you, Daytona. Listen, I understand as of the last 30 minutes, President Biden has called the reporter to personally apologize. CNN is confirming that. And that's what he should have done. Those of us who know Joe Biden knows. We predicted he would make that apology because he is that kind of person. Those of us who know Joe Biden, though, and I worked with him back in the 80s on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, know that he is capable of gaffes. He's capable of speaking into a hot microphone. Remember the famous description of Obamacare? It's a big you-know-what deal. So, you know, Joe Biden doesn't, you know, he's not allergic to a hot microphone and saying something he shouldn't. But I think it's credit that he did call the reporter, which he should have done, and apologized.
Yeah, so we are hearing that he did call the reporter. I have a tweet up here just for a little update. President Biden called tonight. He said, quote, "It's nothing personal, pal," after calling him a stupid SOB, as we heard before. So is that enough for the president to do in response for a situation like this, or is it because he's receiving so much backlash across the board?
No, I think it's who Joe Biden is. It's why he became president. You know, he's fundamentally a decent person who's having a very tough month, who has a simultaneity of crises no president has ever faced. Let's be honest, it's been a tough month. He was actually ahead of the first year of the Trump administration in terms of the stock market at 24.1% appreciation the Trump administration had. He was ahead of that number, and then the last week in the sell-off, it went down to 19.1. And so that kind of stuff, it's everywhere. It's the Russia invasion, it's crime, it's inflation, it's the testing problems. They've now gotten their arms around that to some extent. But there's a simultaneity of frustration created, I think, by the president, and he had a very tough weekend with meetings about Ukraine. So, you know, it's what a president shouldn't do, and I think he knows that.
So what's next for President Biden? Will this be addressed again? What are the next steps for other press conferences? And I do have to say, because we play all these press conferences live here, and he doesn't answer questions a lot during a lot of his events. We did just have a 2-hour press conference last week, and that was the first one that he's had in quite a long time. So sometimes these reporters have to throw out questions to him at events that don't pertain to the questions that they do have some of the reporters asking about Russia and whatnot. So what's the answer to this? What should media do in order to get those questions across to the leaders?
Well, there's always a healthy tension between every White House and every press corps, and this one is no different. Jen Psaki's, I think, done an excellent job as press secretary. She's very sharp. She's combative, so Fox doesn't necessarily like her, but she's pretty popular and pretty competent in a lot of ways. I think the president has to do more, not less, of the press conferences he did last week. When Joe Biden talks for about 2 hours, you're going to have some cleanup to do. That's just who he is. He tells the truth. Sometimes he tells it a little too much. You know, there's a saying in Washington, you're going to tell the truth eventually. Sometimes Joe Biden tells the truth a little earlier than perhaps he'd like to. But they cleaned up his miscomment on the Ukraine. And I think, you know, the president's got to get out there and get back in shape in terms of dealing with the press and not be irritated by the press. You know, he's going to have to sell his agenda to beat the historical trend of a trouncing in the midterm, you know, which today it looks like it'd be pretty tough for the Democrats. He's got a much better story on the economy, the economic recovery than has been told. He's got to tell that proactively in terms of job growth. The unemployment figures have gone down to 3.9, 75% reduction in unemployment claims over the last year. He passed 2 major bills, kept the schools open, and largely distributed the vaccines. And I think they're now getting their arms around testing. He's got a lot of good things to talk about. They got to break up the Build Back Better, chunk it out into parts where Republicans begin to support it, which is why he was elected in the first place. He was elected because the country is center and center right. And finally, he has to, I think, find a way to protect the next election in 2024 in terms of electoral reform, but in ways that Republicans support. I mean, if they've learned one thing, they can't depend on 2 senators that are not supporting them and are not sure where they want to be, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. So, you know, he's going to have to create a new strategy and repivot, and I think that's what he's doing.
Okay, so you're taking a live look from the White House right there. Had to hop out for a little bit of technical difficulties, but that's okay. This is an interesting enough conversation. We're going to bring it right back in. David Morey joining us again live here, political analyst. And we're talking President Biden right now. We're talking about the press conference, those choice words for Fox's Peter Doocy. But I'm curious what your thoughts are for what's next for the president here. What can he be doing better amid all of these issues that the administration undoubtedly is confronting right now?
Well, I do think he has to do more press conferences, as we were talking about. He needs to build up his muscle for that. He's going to have to win in 2024 and survive in 2022 midterms that will be historically challenging by going into combat mode. I think more important even than that, they're going to have to reposition. Number one, they're going to have to break up Build Back Better into chunks for which there is some Republican support. And that'll be an important thing to do. Number two, they're going to have to focus on electoral reform to protect against this whole, the slow motion coup that's being talked about in many articles on many networks. But there's pieces of electoral reform that there's Republican support for. So, they're going to have to really do what Joe Biden was elected to do. He was elected by a country that's in the center and the center right. So he's going to have to go to work and find ways to govern in that center and do a job at that. And then finally, they're going to tell their own economic progress story better than they have. He's two major bills, gigantic progress in terms of unemployment, down 75% in benefit claims, down to 3.9%. Very strong stock market, almost as strong as Trump's first one. He just lost out in the last week. So they're going to have to do all three of those things to survive in 2022 and get ready for 2024.
Yep. And another pretty interesting point made in that press conference that he has reiterated over time. He is standing by his vice president, Kamala Harris. We have not heard from her about what happened today. Likely won't, and likely something else will happen tomorrow. Anything else that you're going to be looking at and looking forward to with the Biden administration into the week, and maybe with Russia as well?
Well, I think, this is the week that Russia is, and this is where all eyes are. If there's going to be a major foreign policy crisis, it's going to happen in the next 10 days, so buckle your seatbelt. Yeah. I think this administration has to keep pivoting to what's working now. Fighting inflation, because it's real, it's perceived, and it's real. Fighting crime, supporting, for example, Eric Adams, the new mayor of New York City, and his approach to fighting crime, and really getting after finding some bipartisan solution. I don't know about you, but I'm tired of Washington not working. I want to see it start to work again.
Yep, definitely excited to see that, and definitely excited to see what possibly could come out of the president's mouth in the future as well. We'll have it live for you here on Live Now from Fox. David Morey, he was joining us. Thank you so much, David, for being with us on the show. We'll speak with you again soon.
Good to be with you, Daytona.
All right, and we are going to keep moving along with the latest from the White House. Actually, Peter Doocy files this report for us while he was reporting on Washington, D.C. and inflation today. The original question from Peter.
We focus on the trends in the economy, not any one day and any single indicator.
So the Dow can drop more than 1,100 points in a day without setting off alarm bells at the Biden White House.
I would note that the market is up around 15% compared to when President Biden took office.
But experts blame today's drop on President Biden's year one policies.
All of this spending stuff that they've done, Sandra, has caused the inflation to go up. It's caused the market to come down quite a bit, especially with interest rates and inflation, and the participation rate is falling as well.
This evening, the president tried to highlight what his administration is doing to lower prices.
Let's have a cabinet meeting.
That's as inflation ranks as the #1 issue registered voters are either extremely or very concerned about in a new Fox News poll. And it's being noticed in Democratic districts.
Well, look, people don't wake up in my district like real political people. They're waking up and they're talking about the price of groceries, the price of gas. They're talking about crime.
Right. Higher U.S. crime rates are the #2 issue voters are most concerned about right now.
On crime, to follow up on what Ed was asking about, would you agree that the most important job for any president is to keep Americans safe?
I would agree.
So you said that the president's never satisfied if people don't feel safe. Does he know that after a year in office, people do not feel safe in this country?
Well, Peter, I think if we look at the facts here, we've seen a surge of crime over the last 2 years.
So they think crime was bad when they got here, and there is no plan to change up the crime-fighting plan that they put into place when they got here, even as violent crime and murder stats trend in the wrong direction. At the White House, Peter Ducey, Fox News.
And more on that, Mark Meredith reports on a Fox News poll that is confirming Americans are nervous about the surge in crime right now. Here's that.
81% of voters say they are concerned about recent spikes in crime. The findings come after a string of high-profile shootings. In New York, 2 officers were shot last week. 1 was killed after an anti-government activist opened fire. The city's new mayor, Eric Adams, who ran as a law and order candidate, says there are limits to what his officers can do, and he's asking the federal government for help.
We need help from the federal government. We're doing our job in NYPD, taking thousands of guns off the street. Every one they take off, we're having 5 come in. How do we stop this?
In the nation's capital, another shooting has residents on edge. On Sunday night, 1 officer was shot during a standoff with a barricaded suspect. And in Milwaukee, an investigation is underway after 6 people were found dead in 1 home, officials calling it a preventable tragedy.
The community is tired. We are tired of seeing people's lives snuffed out too soon in preventable situations.
President Biden says his administration is focused on addressing crime, and there are reports a new executive order may be unveiled within weeks. But critics say the plan under consideration could be an attempt to, quote, defund the police.
This whole nonsense with the divisiveness and defund the police and racism, we're seeing through it. Enough is enough.
The president is dismissing critics who say he wants to defund police departments, but he says those departments do need more money to help address Americans who are struggling with mental illness. At the White House, Mark Meredith, Fox News.
So you just heard from Mark right there. There was a shooting on Friday night. We brought it to you live here on Live Now from Fox, as the NYPD has had 5 officers shot since the beginning of the year. Just that most recent one on Friday night, 1 officer dead, the other still struggling for his life. Here's the latest from Fox 5 in New York.
And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft, and we have been covering this ever since it broke Friday night, that tragic police shooting of that 22-year-old officer in Harlem, leading New York City Mayor Eric Adams to really crack down on crime. He was speaking today, talking about what his plans are to get illegal guns off the street. Joining me now, right outside of City Hall, is Fox 5 New York's Lisa Evers. Lisa, good to see you. What have you learned today? What is the mayor planning?
Well, Andrew, he has a sweeping, multi-tiered plan that he calls the blueprint for safety to deal with the increasing concerns intensifying so much among New Yorkers about this growing gun violence. And it's not only just going to involve the NYPD and law enforcement agencies, but virtually every single city agency. He says the goal is to deal with some of these immediate and long-term problems that have contributed to the gun violence that is now disrupting life in the city and worrying so many people. Now take a look at this video here. The ambush of the 2 police officers on Friday night, coming after several weeks of disturbing shootings, intensified calls for something to be done to stop the bullets from flying. Mayor Adams says fighting gun violence is a battle he's ready for, beginning with putting more police officers on the streets. He's also calling for new mental health services and calling out a court system he says is not doing nearly enough to keep violent offenders locked up and guns out of the hands of teenagers. He announced new teams of police officers will be assigned to the 30 New York City precincts where he says 80% of the shootings occur. And unlike the anti-crime units of the past, they will be specially trained, wear body cameras, and use new technology like facial recognition and weapons detection. The mayor says the NYPD is doing its job with nearly 4,500 gun arrests last year, but he says more needs to be done to stop the flood of weapons that has been coming into the city nonstop. Here's what the mayor had to say this afternoon.
This is the gun that killed our young officer on Friday night. A .45 caliber modified gun. It is illegal to carry a gun in our city, yet our police officers take them off the streets every day in record numbers. Since January 1st, when I took office, our officers have taken 350 illegal guns off the street. Last year, over 6,000 guns were confiscated.
Now, the mayor is also proposing a measure to deal with the trafficking, and this is something that you can be sure will be debated, hotly debated, in the days and weeks to come. He's calling for bag checks and vehicle checks on people and cars and trucks coming into New York City over the bridges and tunnels and the bus stations and the train stations. He wants those done by the Port Authority police officers as well as by the state troopers in each of the two states. He says he'll talk to New York's Governor Hochul and New Jersey's Governor Murphy about this to see how quickly this can be done. Now, in terms of these new units of police officers that will be focusing strictly on guns in the various New York City precincts, they are expected to be rolled out sometime within the next 3 weeks. And as for the police union here, which has been critical of the past mayor, they say that this is a big step in the right direction. That's the latest from New York City. For Live Now, I'm Lisa Evers. Andrew, back to you.
You know, Lisa, that was quite controversial when then Mayor Bill de Blasio disbanded those anti-gun units within the NYPD in response to the worldwide reckoning, really, after the George Floyd killing. But now Mayor Eric Adams is bringing them back. Are people, are they happy about this news? Was that a welcome announcement today?
Well, Andrew, I think it was a welcome announcement among many people, and I think the people that are still upset about that idea are equating what he's proposing with what happened in the past, which was basically a group of plainclothes officers in a dark car. They would do jump outs, they would throw people up against the wall, they would get the guns off the street, and there was a certain amount of fear that was instilled that kept people from carrying guns on the streets. Now we've seen videos, I post them on my Instagram all the time, that the police give us these surveillance videos of people just pulling out guns on the streets of New York City. But what he's proposing is basically a more sophisticated version of this that does not violate people's civil rights, that basically can let people know in the community that there are officers out there who are focusing specifically on that. Now, I had the opportunity to go out with the Gun Violence Suppression Division last spring when they went after a violent gang that was accused of killing a two-year-old baby. And the police are working very hard. They're working with the ATF nationally to track down these illegal guns that are finding their way into New York City. But in terms of the controversy, I think New Yorkers are reached a point with the killing of these two, the killing of the one officer and the grave wounding of the other officer this past weekend, that enough is enough. It's just something has to be done. The city just feels out of control when you have an 11-month-old baby who's sitting in her mother's arms in the backseat of the family car, gets grazed by a stray bullet. You have a 19-year-old young woman who is working in a Burger King to try to make money and go to school and better her life, and she's shot and killed during a robbery, and it's just gotten too reckless for too many people, and people have just been saying something has to be done. And I think what the mayor did today was he came out with a very firm plan, and he minced no words. There was nothing politically correct about it. It was clear, it was very direct, and he also said these laws that were enacted in recent years to supposedly keep minors from being tried as adults, he said those are only criminalizing the youth. And he just went on and on, but a lot also to deal with mental health too, because we have a serious problem with mentally ill people who are violent on the streets of New York City, as we've seen with these subway pushings and some of the shootings that have gone. But Andrew, I think overall, a lot of people feel like he's in charge, he knows what he's talking about, he was a police officer, and he's not afraid to take action. So there's a sense of hope, I think, tonight here in New York.
All right, Fox 5 New York's Lisa Evers, we appreciate your reporting. We'll definitely be speaking again on this topic.
Thank you, Andrew.
So a great conversation right there. Live look from our Phoenix, Arizona studio. 8:40 here in Phoenix, almost 9 o'clock, almost 11 o'clock out on the East Coast as we are taking you through all of the top stories of the day. As we know, crime, a major concern right now, but also another concern for President Biden. Russia. President Biden considering deploying thousands of American forces to Eastern Europe as the world awaits to see if Russia will invade Ukraine. Coming up after the commercial break, we'll bring you the latest on what's going on with Russia, as well as all of the other top stories and breaking news across the country. Don't go away. Welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. President Biden is considering deploying thousands of American forces to Eastern Europe as the world awaits to see if Russia will invade Ukraine. The U.S. troops are now on high alert. Fox's Manuel Rivera brings us the latest.
More than 80 tons of U.S. military equipment, including ammunition, are now in Ukraine. The shipments just a fraction of the roughly $200 million package that the U.S. committed to Ukraine to bolster its defenses, with more than 100,000 Russian troops gathered along its border. And now the president is weighing sending thousands of troops to Eastern Europe, too.
We've never ruled out the option of providing additional assistance in advance of an invasion.
On Monday, the president spoke with European leaders about the escalating tensions. It comes after a working weekend at Camp David, where he was briefed by his national security advisors about a range of options to deter Russia from invading Ukraine. About 8,500 troops are on heightened alert, though no final decision has been made.
The Secretary wants us postured to be ready for any other contingencies as well, but the bulk of them are aligned for the NATO response force.
The State Department is ordering some U.S. Embassy employees and all of their family members in Kiev to leave. NATO is also taking action, sending more ships and fighter jets to Eastern Europe.
We will always do what is necessary to protect and defend all our allies. And I welcome that allies are stepping up.
Meanwhile, Ukrainians living along the Russian border say they're doing their best to live normally despite the threat of an invasion.
We're joking that hope is the last thing to die. All of us are waiting for peace.
Other U.S. allies like the UK, Germany, and Australia are also withdrawing family members of staff from embassies in Ukraine, measures that Ukraine has described as premature. In Washington, Manuel Rivera, Fox News.
So how likely is it that Putin is going to actually invade Ukraine? We spoke with an expert about this earlier. Here's Andrew Kraft and him talking about the likelihood of that and what the Biden administration would do in response.
Right now, though, we want to continue this conversation. It's something so many people are talking about. What will Vladimir Putin do? Will he invade Ukraine? And what does that mean for here in the United States, for our European allies? Joining me now to discuss all of that is foreign policy and national security expert Hal Kempfer. Hal, good to see you. Thanks for being with us. You know, I saw you kind of watching the briefing. You were kind of shaking your head in some moments, nodding in agreement in others. Let's get to the headline of the day, though. 8,500 U.S. troops are being put on alert in order for, possible assistance or readiness to some type of military incursion by Russia into Ukraine. Is this just a sign of deterrence, or do you think these troops will be deployed overseas?
Well, Andrew, I was nodding and shaking at times, and yes, I don't think they're going to be used in the Ukraine. What we're doing is we're bolstering up the NATO allies around the Ukraine. Within each of the NATO countries, the three Baltic states and Poland, we have, I know everyone's going to say this is a horrible term, tripwire. We have a reinforced battalion-sized group, multinational group, that is there. And it is to show NATO resolve on that eastern flank, if you will, that borders up against where NATO ends. That's true with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. It's also true in Poland. Now, Poland borders the Ukraine, and 8,500 looks like a couple of what we call brigade combat teams, very large maneuver elements on the ground, which may or may not involve a lot of tanks, armor. I'm not sure what the configuration is going to be. And I don't know if they're going to try and ship those by air to get them over there, or they're going to fall on equipment that may have been moved within the NATO theater and have them fall on that equipment. The specifics are not out there yet, but it looks like that's the core nucleus. And then there's a lot of other things. There's ISR, which means intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets. And being a retired intelligence officer, I have a pretty good idea of probably what they're looking at moving over there for that. and then also a lot of logistics things that they would need to sustain those forces over a period of time. That's a pretty big footprint. Obviously, when you compare it in raw numbers to the Russians that are moving, that could potentially be moving through the Ukraine, it looks small, but that actually is a pretty good footprint. And in the defense, with everything else we bring with air and stuff, that's a pretty powerful package, which shows at least NATO resolve to defend NATO territory.
You know, and Hal, we have been showing just some file footage over the weekend of some of these shipments that have arrived in Ukraine from, you know, us here as a partner, ammunitions, arms. We've also coordinated, you heard there from John Kirby, the intra-alliance moving around of, helicopters, things like that from some of our other European allies. And so, I saw something today that maybe a lot of people don't realize, but President Biden has not tapped or picked someone to be the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. How does that limit our ability to confront this?
Well, Andrew, obviously we'd like to have a designated Senate-confirmed ambassador there. That does happen. You saw that under the previous administration. There were a lot of acting ambassadors, if you will, charge d'affaires that had kind of got boosted up into be the acting ambassador, the head of the country, team of that country. It always helps to have a designated ambassador there. It shows the country that we're engaging with a certain level of commitment, and the protocol is that this is the president's representative. This is the lead for the United States in terms of whatever we do with that country. So it means a lot, and it is unfortunate that we do not have a Senate-confirmed ambassador there, because that just brings a certain amount of gravitas to our presence within Kiev.
Yeah, and Hal, let's go to the diplomatic side of this now. We've been talking a lot about the military buildup, but over the weekend, we learned that U.S. embassy officials in Kyiv were telling non-essential staff at the embassy and some of their families, to possibly leave Ukraine very shortly. Also, we were getting reporting in to suggest that Ukraine officials think that that move is premature. Do you think that's premature? Are you surprised that even discussion of evacuating U.S. assets at the embassy is in play?
Well, I'm not really surprised. One of the things is if the Russians were to come in, all right, and there's a variety of different scenarios. If they were to move through Belarus, for example, Belarus is really not that far from Kiev. So the concern would be that this thing could get, we could see, literally tanks rolling in and still have a lot of people in the city. And of course, we just went through this thing in Kabul and Afghanistan. So we want to give them a warning order. I think that's a prudent move. Normally, you don't like to advertise it quite that much, but the word was going to get out on this anyway. So they may have just decided to get ahead of that because they knew that people were going to hear about it. But part of that is I've heard two different things. What came out was that they said, okay, families move. And then it was, well, it's not all families. It was non-essential family members and others move. And then what I got actually, which came from overseas, was that they said, well, it wasn't quite that. It was just identified families and non-essential personnel that need to move. So I'm not quite sure where they are in the whole thing. I imagine there are some families where they may have just said, hey, look, why don't you go and you don't need to be here, and I don't know what's going to go on, but let's just take prudent moves. And there may be others where it's just literally just getting names on a roster and building up those flight lists, the manifest and stuff, if we have to move people quickly, if things do kick off. What I do want to mention about this, and one of the reasons we're doing that, I'm sure that other embassies are doing this as well around Kiev, is the concern that some of these missile systems, like the Iskander missile system, they could actually, if something did kick off, you could actually see missiles, large-scale missile strikes coming into Kiev, and they can be coming into the airport. So there is a reason to try and get people out of there, because there's a possibility, if things kick off, that the main airport could end up being shut down because of missile strikes. And so that's that's a huge concern for every country's planners, every diplomatic team there.
Yeah, and we heard from the White House today, and they just don't have, a record or an inventory of how many American citizens are in Ukraine at this present moment. The White House press secretary Jen Psaki said to the likes that, they don't keep tabs or records of when Americans travel abroad. And of course, Ukraine is, considered a Western kind of cosmopolitan society, at least the Western part of Ukraine. So, why would they keep some type of list of Americans there? And so that remains to be seen on whether or not they can, have a full accounting of every American citizen in Ukraine right now. It doesn't look like they can, but yet they're still urging Americans to leave Ukraine. Hal, let's talk about what Putin is thinking. Is he bluffing? Is he really going to do this? Does he really want to do this? Is this some part of a grand design to bring back the good old days of the Soviet Union with some territorial expansion to cement his legacy, or is he not going to do this? Is he bluffing to get more concessions out of the West?
Andrew, I think the answer on that is yes. All right. I think he's got a little bit of both.
Okay.
All right. In his mind, he would love to see the return of the Soviet Union. He has said many times that this was a great failure, that the Soviet Union fell. He would like to see something, a restoration of the larger Russian Empire. And of course, the Ukraine and Belarus and other countries that are independent states were part of that Russian Empire of yore. And if you look back into Russian history, the first capital of a Russian state or Russian kingdom or empire, the first recorded capital was actually Kiev. So for Russians, they don't see the Ukraine as necessarily a separate country. It's just historically part of a larger Russian empire, albeit, distinctively different with different cultural and language and stuff like that. But basically they see it as part of a greater Russia. So that's part of it. However, never underestimate the cold calculations of Vladimir Putin. He's looking at this, and part of this is he does not want to see NATO literally on the doorstep of Russia. I mean, this goes back to Keenan and some of the things said about the Soviet Union after World War II when the Cold War kicked off. Why would they do this? He does not want to see NATO literally at Moscow's doorstep, so to speak. And if NATO was to expand into the Ukraine, it would be right there. I mean, there isn't much buffer between Moscow and NATO at that point. And they've lost the Warsaw Pact, and now, that, to them, that's an unacceptable situation. But the other side of that, too, is he has to do things for his domestic audience. Don't forget, Russia's economy domestically is in a really bad state, and the poverty rate there is overwhelming. And the way that he basically reestablishes his credibility with the Russian people is to do these adventures, whether it's going into Crimea or Georgia or something like that. And so he basically saber rattles and he gets everybody behind him.
Hal, are you concerned about some of the, behind the scenes internal disagreements, especially among our NATO partners? I'm talking, Germany, France, Great Britain, about how to decide what is tantamount to a Russian invasion. There doesn't seem to be agreement on that. There seems to be some daylight. And so, of course, that necessitates a problem with, well, if you don't know what an invasion or incursion is going to look like, then you don't know what the response is going to look like. And we're seeing that play out. Are you concerned by that, that there's really not on the same page, it seems?
Andrew, I wish they were clearly on the same page, because the fact that you're even asked that question says that the perception is they're not on the same page. I'm sure within NATO headquarters, there's an active dialogue to say, look, we're going to come up with a very clear cut. This is what it looks like. When they cross the frontier, or when they do this, whatever it is, when missiles get launched, it should be, I hope, soon clearly identified. However, there are going to be divisions within NATO member countries as to what our response will be. For example, Germany told Estonia, no, you cannot move artillery into the Ukraine, because Estonia wanted to do that. It's German artillery that Germany provided, that sold to Estonia. They said, no, you do not have permission to do that. The reason why is because they feel that that could be a tripwire for a larger, a response from Russia, and they're trying to contain this. Where you stand in Europe really depends on where you sit. One of the problems that Germany has, and Germany is that big central state. I mean, it is the it's huge in terms of how we look at NATO and Europe. The challenge is, after Fukushima, they said we're going to close down our nuclear power plants, and they'd already previously said we're going to close down all the coal burning plants, in order to pursue a more green energy sustainable future. Well, the only way to fill the gap in the short run until they have renewable energy resources capable of meeting their needs is natural gas, and they are dependent on Russian natural gas, and that's a huge issue for them, and they're in the middle of winter right now, and so having the gas supply shut off could have an enormous problem. That's why you see the movement of LNG tankers to the Atlantic to try and help fill that gap. That's why you see us diplomatically working with all these LNG producers around the world to try and bolster up what Europe has in natural gas, because this weighs heavily on the Germans. It weighs heavily on other European states as well. And that's what Russia kind of holds over their head, which is we can literally turn off the spigot. You can boycott us, but we can turn off the spigot and cause some enormous disruptions and problems throughout Europe. So that's one of the backdrop issues. That's why you see Germany kind of hedging and pulling back a little bit. We're leaning forward a bit. I got to tell you, there are some NATO countries that are leaning forward a lot.
Yeah.
All right.
Britain is one of them.
Surprisingly. Now, Britain has gotten very vocal. It's interesting. I was listening to Boris Johnson today, and he's very vocal about this. And there's other countries. Denmark has been fairly forceful in this. I won't go through a list of all the countries. Poland has been very vocal in this, although Poland has a lot riding on it because of where they are.
Right.
One thing I would like to mention, though, Germany is on the front lines. Don't think they're completely pulled back. In Latvia, the Germans actually lead that NATO presence there. So they actually have a presence on the ground that is, right next door to Russia. So they're right there. So they're not, a lot of the impression is that they're holding back. They don't want to do a big force movement right now. By the way, historically, there are reasons why you don't want large German armored divisions rolling through Poland. Okay, there's a little bit of a look on that. In fact, there's the same look they would have if they put German units into Ukraine. Believe me, everybody would be talking about something like that. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to reach a balance on this. So one thing I would like to mention, though, if I could, is I'm not seeing the logistics package yet that would sustain a really big invasion of the Ukraine. And that's, they often say amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics.
Right.
Well, having done this in multiple theaters, I look at logistics because, can you get to Kiev is a big question.
Hal, no, that's just really great insight. Last question for you, because, I like to look at this historically, kind of from a 30,000-foot view. Let's game out the scenario that Russia does invade Ukraine. What does this mean for Europe and for U.S.-European relations? We haven't had a major conflict in Europe since, I'm thinking, the Balkan Civil War in the early 90s. But, besides that, if you think about the post-1945 world order, Europe has been very largely peaceful. If a Russian invasion happened, that would kind of deconstruct a lot of that Americans put in place.
Well, the strange thing is, look, Putin is calculating. Some would say he's diabolical, but sometimes he can't help but get in front of himself. And one of the interesting things is, up until 2014, Ukrainian nationalism wasn't that strong of an element. Now, if you heard Boris Johnson talking today, but others have mentioned it, going into Crimea and what he's done in the Donbas region of southeastern Ukraine, has galvanized Ukrainian nationalism like nothing else could. There are ethnic Russians in the Ukraine who are now fervent Ukrainian nationalists, and in fact, they joined the militias and joined the military to fight the Russians if they came in. Same thing with Europe. You want to, what did NATO, what brought NATO together to begin with, way back when, was the threat of the Soviet Union, which was based on Russia. If they were to take a military action like this, which would kind of upset the post-World War II order in a lot of ways, I think what you'd find is a unification of European, North Atlantic resolve, shall we say. And I think you'd see a lot more permanent basing of NATO forces in places like Poland, the Baltic states. There's even discussion of Finland potentially joining NATO because of what's going on here. And it'll open up other discussions in that realm too. So it could cause some dissension, but I think the dissension is now. I think once something happens, you'll find more unity of effort and certainly unity of opinion.
Yeah, well, Hal Kemper, we always appreciate your time, your insight, and your expertise. And this is definitely not going away. This is definitely being ratcheted up, and we'll definitely have you on in the future to talk about this in the event that this actually does happen. Hal, we appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you, Andrew.
And of course, Russia being brought up in all of the press conferences today. John Kirby at the Pentagon addressing it. We'll play out the full press conference for you. Press Secretary Jen Psaki asked about it as well, what Biden's stance is on that. And he has stood firm, even from the press conference that happened last week. And he said that he is not afraid to put his foot down with Russia, sending strong words to Putin if he does, in fact, decide to invade Ukraine. So more to come on all of that. More to come here on Live Now from Fox. When we come back after the break, mask mandates and COVID-19 updates. We've got it all for you lined up. Plus, what is the economy looking like? We know inflation is a topic of concern right now for President Biden. And we'll be playing out for you that highlight moment, that viral moment today, a hot mic catching President Biden saying some colorful words about one of the press people in the gallery there. So more to come in just 2 minutes. Welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Daytona Everett, taking you to a couple live looks that we have across the country. This right here in New York City, parts of the U.S. could be turning a corner in the COVID-19 pandemic, but hospitals and schools continuing to face staffing shortages. Here's Fox's Jonathan Seri with more.
It's a sign we could be on the other side of the Omicron surge. New COVID-19 infections are declining in areas first hit by the variant, such as the Northeast. But some parts of the South and West have not reached the peak of this surge. The World Health Organization warning countries today not to let their guard down.
Globally, the conditions are ideal for more variants to emerge. To change the course of the pandemic, we must change the conditions that are driving it.
Even as the surge subsides, infections are still keeping workers home sick or quarantined. Federal data show more than a fifth of U.S. hospitals reported critical staffing shortages over the last week. Some medical experts fear the shortage could lead to a backlog of care.
The end of the pandemic, I think, when that comes, is but simply the starting point for how we deal with the mountains of backlog of unmet care that's built up during the course of the pandemic.
Schools across the country also facing a shortage of teachers and staff. The majority of school districts have remained open, but some have turned to substitute teachers and parents to fill the gaps. In Oakland, California, teachers are demanding a better plan in case a number of them are out sick.
We want to make sure that these are solid commitments from the district that are going to last us through the end of the school year.
Nearly 4,500 schools did not offer in-person learning for at least one day last week due to COVID. In Atlanta, John Panseri, Fox News.
And a groundswell of opposition to vaccine mandates showed up in the nation's capital on Sunday when thousands of protesters made their presence known. They're not the only ones who are upset over COVID rules and regulations right now, though. Virginia's new governor threw out his predecessor's mask mandate in public schools and promptly triggered a lawsuit by 7 of the state's school boards. All of this maneuvering has emotions raw on both sides, as you can imagine. Fox's Caroline Shively has details from Virginia.
Protesters from around the U.S. descended on Washington Sunday for the Defeat the Mandates rally, speaking out against COVID vaccine requirements.
I like to be able to choose what I put into my body. I have 8 children, and I am fighting for their freedom.
Just over the D.C. border in Virginia, another COVID mandate controversy. On Monday, 7 local school boards filed a lawsuit to challenge Governor Glenn Youngkin's executive order to leave masking decisions in public schools up to parents, even when local school boards have voted to require them.
This is really about parents making the best decision for their children. That is absolutely what's already in the code of Virginia. I think the people playing politics is trying to do a one-size-fits-all mandate on every parent in every school district.
Some health experts are urging governments to wait before removing the masks.
I think it is too soon to do that because a lot of schools have built their preparations around the use of masks. And whatever we want to say about the benefit that masks are providing, it's providing some benefit.
Dr. Anthony Fauci says health officials need everything possible to fight the disease.
If we want to get out of this outbreak, vaccines, along with treatment, along with testing, and along with masking, is a very important part of the comprehensive approach to ending this pandemic.
A bit of good news on the COVID front. Dr. Fauci predicts that most states will peak in Omicron infections by next month. Caroline Shively, Fox News.
And of course, we know that there's some economic jitters for the White House as fears over inflation and crime continue to rise across the country. Here's Fox's Caroline Shively with more on that from the White House.
President Biden had a memorable hot mic moment on Monday when a Fox News reporter asked him,
Do you think inflation is a political liability ahead of the midterms?
That's a great asset. More inflation. What a stupid son.
A new Fox poll shows 85% of Americans are extremely or very concerned about inflation and higher prices. Democrats in Congress appear worried, too.
Under this president, we've created more than 6 million jobs. That is the greatest job creation in the first year of a president in history. On the other hand, much of the wage gains being experienced by my constituents and by Americans all over is being pinched by higher grocery and gas costs.
Republicans blame President Biden's policies and are already using it as a campaign issue.
We're going to stop this wasteful spending. We're going to stop this inflation.
But financial analysts say it's the Federal Reserve and not politicians which could make the real difference. Just the threat of interest rate hikes caused the market to plunge, then soar on Monday.
It seems that the Fed is actually going to have to be a little bit more aggressive than expected. And this is why we're starting to see a lot more volatility in stock market.
The White House said the president doesn't judge the economy based on stock performance, but noted the market is up about 15% since he took office. In Washington, Caroline Shively, Fox News.
And speaking of the stock market, how is it looking right now? Here's your Fox Business Brief.
Peloton feeling the burn after its tumble. Activist investor Blackwell's Capital is pushing for the company to fire CEO John Foley and pursue a sale. The call comes after the company's stock plummeted more than 80% from its high amid news reports indicating the company would halt production. Foley says Peloton is instead considering scaling back production and considering layoffs. Well, a bidding war brewing for Kohl's. The retail chain has received a second takeover offer. The bid from hedge fund Starboard Value worth roughly $9 billion. That tops the bid from Acacia Research made last week. Kohl's has been under pressure to boost its share price. Two investment firms with a stake in the company have called on Kohl's to make changes or sell itself. Well, tax season has arrived. The IRS is now accepting and processing 2021 tax returns. But you might have to wait for your refund as the agency struggles with a worker shortage and a massive backlog from last year. The IRS says that avoiding a paper return will be more important than ever this year to avoid processing delays. And Apple is expected to unveil its new 5G iPhone SE and iPad at its first launch event of the year. It's long-rumored devices like an Apple competitor to the Amazon Echo and possibly an Apple AR/VR headset could also be unveiled. No date for the event yet, but reports say we could see one in March or April. Well, for more stories, log on to foxbusiness.com. In New York, I'm Cheryl Casoni.
All right, great info right there. This one's for all of the Olympics fans out there. American athletes going for gold at this year's Winter Olympics. They're going to be tested not only on the ice and slopes, but with some pretty intense living conditions at the Olympic Village in Beijing. Strict protocols are in place to avoid a potential outbreak of COVID-19. Fox's Alex Hogan has more.
With less than 2 weeks to go until the start of the Beijing Winter Olympics, there's growing concern for the safety of U.S. athletes attending the Games. The U.S. is one of at least 9 countries staging a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics over human rights abuses in China. The IOC has a long-standing rule against athletes making political statements at the Games. That's now backed up by the threat of punishment from the organizing committee in Beijing.
In this situation, it is just not worth it for athletes to speak out. The only answer is to say that athletes should stay silent until they get home, and that's a really horrible place to be.
The first cases of the novel coronavirus were detected in Wuhan, China at the end of 2019. Now the country will host the global event that welcomes competitors from all over the world. There have already been at least 72 cases among Olympic staff, a number that the top medical expert for the Games says is expected and comparable to what was seen at the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo. So far, none of the athletes arriving in Beijing have tested positive. The plan, once again, is to keep athletes in a bubble for the duration of the Games.
This is distracting them from sport, and so yes, they may feel isolated, but more than that, they're going to feel like their performances are not the most important thing at the Olympics.
All participants will need to prove that they have been vaccinated and submit to daily COVID testing. The limited crowds are encouraged to clap instead of shout to prevent the airborne spread of the virus. In London, Alex Hogan, Fox News.
And speaking of human rights concerns out in China, Senator Rick Scott holding a press conference today alongside activists to speak out specifically about this. We'll be playing that out after this commercial break. And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Daytona Everett. An event held today, a press conference. Senator Rick Scott out in Florida talking about human rights concerns ahead of the Olympics. We're going to play that out for you as he speaks with some activists, too, who are alongside him.
So, you want us to stand here? Yeah, if you just, we all just stand up here. So, no, I'm sure. Is everybody ready? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody for being here today. I want to thank all the human rights advocates we have here today. Folks from Hong Kong Watch, the Hong Kong Social Action Movement, the Hong Kong Professional Network, DC4HK, the Campaign for Uyghurs, and the Uyghur Human Rights Project do so much to call attention to the horrific human rights abuses we'll talk about today, and thank them all for their hard work. I've been up here in the Senate now for 3 years, and I've learned that in this building, too many people have a hard time stating simple facts and forcing accountability. It is a fact that the Communist Chinese Party is committing horrific human rights abuses against Tibetans, Hong Kongers, and Uyghur Muslims. It is a fact that at the direction of General Secretary Xi, the Communist Chinese Party is committing genocide and desecrating the Uyghur homeland. It is a fact that Beijing continues to systematically destroy democracy in Hong Kong. I saw it with my own eyes when I visited there in 2019. Next week, the 2022 Olympics will begin in Beijing, and the world will watch as Communist China, it's Communist China, let's never forget that, whitewashes these crimes and churns its propaganda machine to make the world forget just how evil this empire is. I can't tell you how worried I am about the athletes competing in Beijing. Look at what Communist China did to silence and disappear Peng Shuai. It's terrifying. I've called on the IOC and the Biden administration to take every step necessary to keep Americans safe. But unfortunately, I haven't heard a word from them on what they're doing about it. We cannot let anyone forget about what is happening in Communist China. NBC must use the Olympics to highlight these atrocities. Sadly, I doubt they will. That's why we're here today, to make sure no one forgets. For years, I've been calling for the Olympics not for a boycott, but be moved out of Communist China. For years, I've been highlighting Communist China's brutal abuses and demanding accountability for Communist China's genocide and attacks on democracy. For years, I've been demanding businesses to stop doing business with Communist China. Look, all we know, when you do business with Communist China, it enriches the Chinese ruling class, the Communist Chinese ruling class, and funds its oppression. We must be clear in the United States and America that Communist China's abuses will not be tolerated. We must call out these crimes, and we must stand by the brave advocates. I mean, you have to be a brave advocate to stand up to Communist China. And you look at what they do to their families for freedom and democracy in China, Hong Kong, Tibet, and all around the world. We must show that the United States is an unyielding and unapologetic advocate for human rights and unafraid of speaking the truth and upsetting General Secretary Xi and his Communist Party thugs. That's why we're here today, to call out these abuses and give a voice to those who Communist China is working to oppress. The people with me here today have lived it. I want you to hear straight from each of them. With that, first I'd like to introduce Joey Su, Policy Advisor for Hong Kong Watch. Thank you, Senator.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joey Su from Hong Kong Watch. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you, Senator, for organizing this very important press conference. Since Hong Kong's massive pro-democracy movement broke out in 2019, more than 10,000 protesters have been arrested at the age of youngest 13. They have been arrested, abused, charged, and convicted. And over 750 of them have been found guilty of rioting, facing up to 10 years in prison simply for taking part in the very peaceful pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. Since the enactment of the national security legislation on June 30th, 2020, over 150 individuals have been charged under ridiculous crimes like subversion, colluding with foreign forces. And from activists and politicians to legal professionals and educators, every dissenter in the city is now at the risk of facing unreasonable and lengthy imprisonment simply for being the voice of the now silenced people of Hong Kong. Up until today, more than 70 civil society organizations, including political associations, student unions, and protest groups, have been forcibly shut down, and many of them have also seen their core members arrested and persecuted. At least 11 media outlets, including Apple Daily, Stand News, and Citizens News, have ceased operations. Hong Kong's media tycoon Jimmy Lai has been held behind bars for almost 400 days up until today. And all the other journalists and reporters were detained simply for documenting the Chinese Communist Party's atrocities and human rights abuses in Hong Kong. Hong Kongers have lost not only our freedom of speech, assembly, and free press. Those who remain in the city today also are under the fear of being persecuted every single day just for voicing opposition to the government. China has violated every promise made under the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 to uphold Hong Kong's basic freedoms, rule of law, and autonomy. And unfortunately, that is not the only international commitment that the Chinese Communist Party has violated. While crackdowns in Hong Kong escalate, more than 1 million Uyghur and Turkic Muslims continue to be held in concentration camps. They are undergoing forced sterilization, systematic sexual abuse, forced labor, and political indoctrination. Countless of them, including the retired medical doctor Gulshan Abbas, have been disappeared by the Chinese Communist Party for years. And just a week ago in Tibet, Tashi Wangchuk, the prominent language rights activist who was detained for 6 years simply for courageously speaking out against Beijing's discriminatory language policies, he again chose to stand up for his people and then again facing arrest. Where are all these Uyghurs? Where is the very brave tennis player Peng Shuai, who stood up for herself? Where is Zhang Zhan, the journalist who exposed Wuhan's situation since the COVID-19 pandemic first began? With all these questions unanswered, and our family and friends still behind bars, how can anyone still participate in the Olympics, hosted by a regime who has their hands full of blood of countless innocent people? The world cannot continue to sit back in silence. A strong and clear message has to be sent that the CCP and any of its supporters will not escape from its responsibilities without paying a price. We welcome a diplomatic boycott, but that is far from enough. We need the US to take the lead to hold the International Olympics Committee accountable for rewarding a genocidal regime with such an important international event, and to hold sponsors of the genocidal games who sacrifice human rights for financial gains accountable. The CCP's authoritarian behavior and repressive policies against Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, and Tibetans cannot be normalized. Any form of participation in the upcoming 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics is equivalent to endorsing its escalating atrocities. And any form of appeasement policy is no different than allowing China to continue its oppression, and even inviting it to our backyards. And as Cantor Freedom once said, all the gold medals in the world aren't worth selling your morals. And I hope that we, especially our governments and policymakers, will always remember this. Nothing is worth sacrificing human rights for, whether in Hong Kong or in the US or beyond. And Senator Scott, I remember you are actually the first sitting member of Congress to visit Hong Kong amid the 2019 protests. And I'm very glad that he remained one of the strongest allies of the people of Hong Kong. And I also want to acknowledge the Hong Kong community members in Washington area who are in the audience today, especially the HADC leadership team and all the others. They have doing a lot of great work to advocate for our cause and to defend human rights from the encroachment of the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you, everyone.
So I was blessed to have the opportunity to go to Hong Kong during the protests back in, I guess, 2019. And one of the individuals I've had the opportunity to work with since before and then is Samuel Chu, president and founder of the Campaign for Hong Kong.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Joey, for the words that you have shared. And I want to take the cue from Senator Scott, who said, I think, something very true about Capitol Hill, which is that sometimes the simplest truth has to be stated up front and clearly. So let me start by saying that we really shouldn't have to be here today, because these games of the 2022 Winter Olympics should have never been awarded to China in the first place. And there were ample opportunity for the IOC and for many bodies to make sure that we did not have to come to this. China has consistently showed in 2001 to secure the rights for the 2008 Olympic Games. The Chinese government made all the promises to improve human rights, press freedoms, treatments of dissidents, internet censorships. They not only broke those promises, they have doubled down on the repression and exported it beyond its border. And by failing to hold China accountable for those abuses in the lead up and during the 2008 Games, the IOC effectively told the CCP that it could do whatever it wants without fear of repercussions and sanctions. As I've said, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And fool me 3 times, then I think there's a scam and a con that everybody is in on. Like this weekend, the noted veteran sportcaster Bob Costa, who covers 12 different Olympic Games, said, the IOC deserves all of the disdain and disgust that are coming its way for returning the game to China. They are shameless. In 2019, Russia was banned from playing and hosting any international sporting events for doping for 4 years. It was later reduced to 2 years. But imagine, Russia, for doping, is banned from a game that is hosted by a regime committing genocide. Let that sink in. If a 4-year ban is justified for doping, what is the equivalent justification for penalties that threatens the lives and the freedoms of millions of the Uyghurs in their homeland, of the 7.5 million Hong Kongers, and even the safety of the 23.5 million Taiwanese and their sovereignty? Hosting the Olympic has become the go-to solution for the CCP and authoritarian regime to whitewash their crimes, to boost their international image, to strengthen alliance, to use it to build and strengthen their security apparatus and surveillance. I also want to echo Senator Scott's call that the burden is now on the broadcasters, NBC, Universals, and broadcasters around the world who pay billions of dollars and will reap billions of profits to put a spotlight on the plight of the Uyghurs, of Hong Kongers, and all those who suffer in the repression. I bring a final word from Angela Gui, who's a founding member for the Campaign for Hong Kong, who's the daughter of Guo Minghai, a Swedish Hong Kong bookseller who was kidnapped in Thailand and now imprisoned in China for publishing books that are critical of the CCP. She said that it's imperative as the official broadcaster, like NBC in the US, that they do not reproduce and spread any CCP propaganda, as many of the media outlets did in broadcasting my father's forced confession on television. I ask that you and your affiliates would be clear and provide coverage on the Chinese government human rights abuses in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs and the suppression of democracy in Hong Kong and the plight of all political prisoners like my father. I often hear people argue that the games are not about geopolitical issues, that the games are about something bigger. I agree. The games are about something bigger. The ideals and the values of the Olympic movement cannot be achieved or won on the field unless they become lived realities for everyone off the field. So that's my call for all of us. Let's make the Olympics about something bigger. Let's show that we're not going to be complicit in the abuse that we witness and bear witness to today. Thank you, Senator Scott, and thank you for my brothers and sisters who are here.
Next, we're going to hear from, hope I get the name right. Alfadar. You'll do the whole name so I don't mess it up. But with the Uyghur American Association.
Thank you, Senator Scott.
Probably give him your name better than I would.
I do understand. I have a very unique name. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank Senator Scott and his amazing team, and also everyone who's standing here against injustice. We are gathered here today to stand against an Olympics tainted by the Chinese Communist Party's crimes against humanity and genocide. The Chinese government seeks to sport wash its human rights record with the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics, but not on our watch. As we have done in the years leading up to the Olympics, we will continue to ask how the world can continue to blindly embolden the Chinese government and continue to play and do business as usual when that government commits crimes against humanity and genocide against the Uyghurs and Tibetans. When that government continues to destroy the spark of the democracy in Hong Kong and threatens to do the same in Taiwan. As a member of Uyghur community, I will stand with brothers and sisters from Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and will continue to ask these questions on February 4th, when the Games are scheduled to begin in Beijing. I will ask again on February 5th, the anniversary of the 1997 Gulja massacre, where thousands of Uyghur men, women, and children took the streets to peacefully protest against discrimination, but were met by the brute force by the security forces. And if the Olympics go forward, I will ask every day and again on February 20th, when the Olympics are scheduled to end. And I will ask again in the days and weeks and months after about the large stain on human rights that is in the Beijing 2022 Olympics. Is that what the Olympics and the sportsmanship stands for? The goal of the Olympics is to contribute to the building a peaceful and better world with the spirit of friendship, solidarity, and fair play. There is no fairness in awarding a government responsible for ongoing crimes against humanity and genocide an opportunity to sport wash its crimes with the Olympics. Business sponsors such as Coca-Cola and Airbnb should end their complicity in the CCP's business of genocide and slave labor if they don't want to go down in the history as the sports sponsors of the genocide Olympics. We call on athletes to stand with us in the spirit of friendship, solidarity, and fair play, and use their platforms to amplify our calls for justice and accountability. Be true champions by standing on the side of the oppressed. Thank you so much.
Next, we're going to hear from Mustafa Arsku, Human Rights Project. And by the way, everybody standing up here has a story. They have a story about their family, and they have a story about friends and what's happening to them.
Thank you, Senator Scott. I'm very grateful to you for speaking out so strongly about my people and everyone else who is suffering atrocities at the hand of the Chinese government. As I speak, millions of Uyghurs are subject to China's endless atrocity crimes. Uyghur men and women are suffering unspeakable trauma, torture, and sexual violence. Millions are detained with no trial. At least 800,000 Uyghur children have been taken away from their families by force and are being raised in government orphanages and boarding schools. It is likely that most of them will never see their families again. And the government is carrying out the campaign of forced sterilization and forced abortion. Uyghur business leaders are subjected to unfair trials and given long prison sentences like 14 or 20 years. Then their business assets are confiscated and sold on Alibaba's auction site. The Uyghur Human Rights Project and the Wall Street Journal found evidence of at least $84 million of property sold online in the last 3 years. The possession of property is a key hallmark of genocide. My own family members are suffering surveillance, harassment, threats, and detention. My classmates and teachers and neighbors have disappeared. I don't even know whether some of them are alive or dead. Our mosques are desecrated or paved over. Hundreds of cemeteries have been bulldozed. Even the dead are not left in peace. For the world to treat the 2022 Winter Olympics as business as usual is an outrage. I hope that people can see that it is not just another sporting event. Every time when you see the NBC logo and the 5 Olympic rings, you need to see what is behind the screen. Hundreds of concentration camps where my people are suffering.
So you've been listening in to an event hosted by Senator Scott there out in Florida alongside activists who are calling on NBC, calling on major leaders who are supporting Beijing Olympics as they're supposed to start, I believe, next week. I'll have to double check on that, but very soon here, in asking them to boycott the Olympics because of the human rights concerns that are going on in China as we speak right now. So there are concerns, though, not only abroad, but right here at home, a surge in crime. And according to a Fox News poll, that is a real major concern right now. Details on that coming up after the break. Welcome back here to Live Now from Fox, a look from New York City. According to a new Fox News poll, the majority of Americans are concerned about a possible rise in violent crime, especially out in New York City. I spoke with an expert, a defense lawyer, about what the surge is all about. What's the root of this? Here's that conversation.
You're watching Live Now from Fox. I'm Daytona Everett. I'm joined now by Randy Zellen. He's a defense attorney out in New York. We've had him on the show to kind of break down many of these trials and cases, major high-profile cases. But we're now bringing you on, Randy, to talk about a surge in crime in New York. And you're going to bring a really interesting perspective about this because you're defending a lot of these criminals out there, but you were also a resident of New York. So I'm curious to know what your thoughts are. Since the beginning of the year, 5 NYPD officers have been shot. That's since the beginning of the year, 2022. Just the most recent one's coming on Friday. It is surging right now, and I don't think that's an understatement.
It is difficult for me to adequately describe the internal conflict and the wrestling match that I go through with myself on a daily basis, because as a criminal defense attorney, defending criminals or alleged criminals, because everyone's presumed innocent until they are either convicted or they take a plea. But in that backdrop, anything that I can do to help my clients, that's my job. That is my professional obligation. That is what I do this for. And if it means that a client of mine walks out with me without having to post bail, I've done my job. If it means that in New York City, in Manhattan, in the borough of New York County, I will be able to get a better disposition for my client merely because a district attorney brags newly stated policies, I've done my job. Wonderful. But as a human being, as a citizen, as a husband, as a father, as a friend, it's horrifying to me to watch defendants and watch judges who are completely handcuffed, have no discretion, must release this defendant back to the street, where, yes, we are now seeing a spike in turnstile justice. I'm arrested, I'm booked, I'm brought before a judge, I'm released, and I go and I do it again. So bail reform perhaps has emboldened the criminal element. When you stack on top of that, district attorney brags newly stated policy, and I'm being a bit sarcastic and a bit cynical, but it's more or less of, listen, as long as you don't kill anybody, as long as you don't really hurt somebody badly, you know what? It's okay.
Okay, but
I know I'm overstating it, but I'm not that far off. So layer that on top, add another pancake to the pancake below, and all of a sudden, why wouldn't I be emboldened as a criminal? Why wouldn't I say, you know what, it's the cost of doing business. So what? I spend the night in jail, I'm out. My lawyer going to get me a deal. I'll be able to do this again. It truly does, at some level, risk all of us, put all of us at risk, because it could be viewed as simply a cost of doing business. So from a human being standpoint, it's hard for me to wrap my head around, because, by the way, you can have bail reform ideas. They don't have to be written in stone. You want to give judges discretion like they had to set bail or not set bail, let the judge hear the arguments? Great, we've always had that. As a district attorney, you want to quietly talk to your line assistants about their discretion? Great. You don't have to broadcast it for everyone to hear, because when you take those two ideas, it is a recipe for complete and abject lawlessness.
So if you could, we have a lot of people who are watching right now who probably are confused on what the rules are when it comes to bail. When a criminal comes into custody and then they are released, what could that timeline look like? I know it's different for every case, but give us an example.
Well, for example, in the borough of Manhattan, depending on what time a defendant is arrested, and depending how busy things are at central booking, because it's basically a funnel. Everything goes through central booking. That's why it's called central booking. So by the time processed fingerprints, photographs, what we call pedigree, name, rank, and serial number, if you will, and the fingerprints come back from Albany to determine whether or not the defendant has prior contacts with the criminal justice system. Maybe you get to the judge the same day or the same night. Maybe you get to the judge the next morning. But be that as it may, since with bail reform, there are what we call, and it's kind of weird, they're called non-qualifying offenses. That's a good thing. If my offense doesn't qualify, I'm going to be released in my own recognizance. The judge really doesn't have any say in the matter. We've seen a couple of instances where a judge has had the intestinal fortitude to say, listen, I don't give a crap about the statute. I'm setting bail. Well, then it goes upstairs to the appellate folks and they say, hey, sorry, there's a statute and you can't circumvent the statute. Sorry, listen, people, if you don't like it, then talk to your lawmakers. But there's bail reform. So what happens is we see defendants being arrested and then being cut loose, where in the old days, a judge had the discretion and in all likelihood would have set bail, and that defendant either would not have made bail, so the defendant would be in custody and now could not cause more difficulties out on the street, or would have to post enough bail where whether it was his or her money or family money, you don't want to lose that money and make people homeless. So there was an incentive to kind of try to stay on the straight and narrow. That incentive is now gone.
We have a whole new police chief out there. We have a new mayor. We have a whole new set of people who likely will come in and try to change things up. The most recent initiative was putting gun checks at entry points, buses and train stations. Do you think that that is the right angle for them to be taking to curb crime?
The problem is you run into a few problems. And this is where it is really hard to be in law enforcement. And it is hard to be up in the executive levels of law enforcement. And putting aside everything that we've talked about previously, where we talk about whether or not there's systemic racism, law enforcement mistreatment, particularly of men of color, put that off to the side for the moment. And I'm not minimizing it, but that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about law enforcement's role in a perfect world. And law enforcement's role in a perfect world is to enforce the law. That's why it's called law enforcement. But when you have bail reform, so you do your job, you do everything you're supposed to do, you do it right, you do it by the book, you make an arrest. Great. Defendants back out on the street in 12 hours. And then if that's not bad enough, your chief, the head, the man, the district attorney has basically let it be known to the world that my new policies are, we're going to take it easy on crime. We're going to go soft on crime. You have to say to yourself, what the hell am I doing this for? Great. So the defendant will be put back out on the street with no bail. And then the prosecutor is basically going to say, listen, we're very sorry to have troubled you. Take care. All is good. Why would you put your life on the line? And we've seen 5 lives already lost. Why would you leave your wife and kids, or leave your husband and kids, or leave your significant other and kids, or not kids, just leave, not knowing if you're going to come home?
Yeah.
And this is what you are doing this for. So bail reform can put that arrestee back out on the street, and the district attorney's office can put that person back out on the street with little or no consequences. What the hell am I doing this for? And again, I'm saying that as a defense attorney, where that's to my benefit for all of these things to happen.
Right. That's what I was.
I'm a hero.
Hey, this is very much an interesting perspective coming from your angle, but I'm sure you've had a series of conversations with people who do end up making it to trial. What do defendants tell you about the situation out on the streets right now? What is their perspective?
It's interesting because no more than Johnny Cochran, and I can assure you, Johnny Cochran did not ask OJ if he killed Nicole and Ron. We as defense attorneys, we really don't engage in that level of conversations with our clients. First of all, we like our clients to believe that we're not judging them. We like our clients to believe that we don't care what they've done. It is not our job to determine their guilt. It is our job to do nothing more than say, is the evidence sufficient to convict you beyond a reasonable doubt? And that's it. So when you start getting into conversations, so, hey, tell me what it's like out there, or you're almost saying to your client, well, tell me what it's like to be a bad person. Yeah. So I know me, I've been doing that long enough that I'm sensitive to that. And I really make sure that my clients understand that if I'm ever going to judge a client, I won't be a defense attorney anymore. I'll try to get myself a black robe and be a judge. So my clients are treated the way I would want to be treated. No judgments. All I do is observe the evidence and make decisions about the evidence. So no, we really don't get into conversations even so much as, hey, did you do it? And why'd you do it? And how'd you do it? Because that just hamstrings my ability to adequately defend my client.
Interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, the main target right now has been curbing crime by taking the guns off the streets. You're saying bail reform is definitely the main trigger right now. That is.
Yeah, and then remember something. Not only do you have bail reform, which to me just stands the notion of even letting a judge be a judge on its head, no more than when the federal sentencing guidelines were mandatory and we took discretion away from judges. I thought that was insane. So when you take bail reform, you add to that District Attorney Bragg's stated policies, we haven't even gotten to the legitimacy of the constitutional arguments of gun checks and search and seizure. We saw what happened with stop and frisk. We see these well-intended ideas because the intention is good, which is we want to prevent crime. We want to stop crime before it actually happens. We don't want to be reacting to a shooting. We want to take that gun away so there won't be a shooting. The problem is you start to trespass now into citizens' rights and, for example, the Fourth Amendment and the constitutionality of a proper search and a proper seizure, particularly without a warrant. And we know that there is a presumption that if law enforcement doesn't have a warrant, it's presumptively an unreasonable search and seizure. So you have to come up now with an exception. So these checks may be well-intended, but I can assure you they're going to be challenged. And they're well-meaning challenges because we do have the Constitution. We're not a police state. We may all be much safer if we lived in a police state where right now law enforcement could kick my door in and do a top-to-bottom search of my apartment to see whether or not I have a gun. And if I have an illegal gun, you just took an illegal gun off the street. You completely forgot about my constitutional rights, but hey, is it worth it for us to be safer? And I think most of us, when push comes to shove, would probably say no. I don't want to live in a police state so I can live safer. So somehow we have to find that balance. And right now we are in Boomerang City. And there's going to be an overreaction and an overcorrection before we find equilibrium and before we get back to some sense of normalcy.
Yeah. Well, it is unfortunately a continuous issue, and I feel like we end up having these conversations after every single shooting that happens. Specifically, these have been targeted at first responders, but even innocent bystanders, civilians getting pushed in front of subway trains and murdered in their place of work out in California. Different topic, but it will be something to watch, especially with new blood in there. And I appreciate having your perspective on here, not only as a defense attorney, but also as just a resident in New York.
Thank you. And it's always a privilege to be on with you.
Yep. We'll talk to you soon.
Welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Daytona Everett. It is 10 o'clock here in Phoenix. It is midnight out on the East Coast as we hit the top of the hour. Thank you so much. So many of you tuning in. We have so many people, not only here in the United States, around the world, who are tuning into all of our platforms. We are pretty much everywhere. You can find us everywhere. You can find us on social media, Twitter at LiveNow Fox. You can find me on Twitter at Daytona LiveNow. If you ever have any questions or you want us to be touching on a topic that maybe we aren't talking about, we'd love to do that. That's what we do here. We bring you live events from across the country and we show you the feeds no matter where they are as it's happening. But then we also bring on experts to talk about the context of everything, break it down very simply so we can understand what's going on. And so that's what we do here. So be sure to be reaching out again, Daytona Everett at Daytona Live Now. Be sure to reach out. Would love to hear from you. Well, considering one of our top topics today was President Biden, we are going to actually go into some of the latest when it comes to Russia. President Biden considering deploying thousands of American forces to Eastern Europe as the world waits to see if Russia will invade Ukraine. Those U.S. troops are now on high alert. Fox's Madeline Rivera brings us the latest.
More than 80 tons of U.S. military equipment, including ammunition, are now in Ukraine. The shipment's just a fraction of the roughly $200 million package that the U.S. committed to Ukraine to bolster its defenses, with more than 100,000 Russian troops gathered along its border. And now the president is weighing sending thousands of troops to Eastern Europe, too.
We've never ruled out the option of providing additional assistance in advance of an invasion.
On Monday, the president spoke with European leaders about the escalating tensions. It comes after a working weekend at Camp David, where he was briefed by his national security advisors about a range of options to deter Russia from invading Ukraine. About 8,500 troops are on heightened alert, though no final decision has been made.
The Secretary wants us postured to be ready for any other contingencies as well, but the bulk of them are aligned for the NATO response force.
The State Department is ordering some U.S. Embassy employees and all of their family members in Kiev to leave. NATO is also taking action, sending more ships and fighter jets to Eastern Europe.
We will always do what is necessary to protect and defend all our allies. And I welcome that allies are stepping up.
Meanwhile, Ukrainians living along the Russian border say they're doing their best to live normally despite the threat of an invasion.
We're joking that hope is the last thing to die. All of us are waiting for peace.
Other U.S. allies like the UK, Germany, and Australia are also withdrawing family members of staff from embassies in Ukraine, measures that Ukraine has described as premature. In Washington, Madeline Rivera, Fox News.
And Press Secretary John Kirby, you heard from him briefly right there, held a press conference today and was really drilled with questions on the next steps that Biden will be taking, how imminent this attack could be, and so much more. So we're going to listen in to that full press conference for you right here on Live Now.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just one thing here at the top. As you're all aware, the United States is deeply concerned about the current situation in Europe. We remain keenly focused on Russia's unusual military activities near the Ukrainian border, including in Belarus, and consulting extensively with our transatlantic allies and partners. The department continues to support diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the situation. Now, as the president has said, even as we continue to prioritize diplomacy and dialogue, we must also increase readiness. In support of its obligations to the security and defense of NATO and the security of its citizens abroad, at the direction of the president and following recommendations made by Secretary Austin, the United States has taken steps to heighten the readiness of its forces at home and abroad so that they are prepared to respond to a range of contingencies, including support to the NATO response force if it is activated. As you have heard me describe many times, our commitment to the security of NATO allies and our Article 5 commitment are ironclad. As the president has also made clear, the United States will act firmly in defense of its national interests in response to to actions by Russia that harm us, our allies, our partners. As part of that commitment, the Department of Defense maintains significant combat-capable forces forward in Europe to deter aggression and enhance the alliance's ability to defend allies and defeat aggression if necessary. The United States also has a commitment to provide forces to the NATO response force, or otherwise known as the NRF, in the event that NATO should activate that construct. And as you may know, the NRF is a multinational force made up of land, air, maritime, and special operations forces, all components that the alliance can deploy on short notice wherever needed. Altogether, the NRF comprises around 40,000 multinational troops. Within the NRF is something called the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, or VJTF. This NRF element, which is about 20,000 strong across all domains, includes a multinational land brigade of around 5,000 troops and air, maritime, and special operation forces components. I want to provide some facts on these preparations.